It's battle scars.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, my clock says it's 4 o'clock. So it's time for us to call this meeting to order. Oh, boy. And could we have a roll call, please?
Councilors Matilda Novak,
Here.
Dick Olson, Marilyn Smith,
Here.
Stacy Bartholomew,
Hello?
Ray Kopczynski,
Here.
Alex Johnson, the second,
Here.
Bessie Johnson.
Here.
Committee members Jesse Brenneman,
Here.
Colleen Keller, Keith Losey, Will Summers,
Here.
Jared Taylor, Terry Vernig, Chris Hansen.
Here.
I heard somebody online, and I think also Jared was supposed to join online as well.
Okay. So we have a couple online and then those here. So welcome, everybody. If you've looked at the agenda, it didn't say a lot. So what I wanted to do is kind of set things up a bit. Last meeting, the staff went over where revenues come from for the city. They're trying to educate us so that whenever we're listening to their budget message, we have a lot more understanding of where the revenues are coming from, where the expenses are. So tonight, the staff will be sharing the expense side of our balance sheet. And that could take all night, but I'm glad they're going to pare it down to just an hour. The next meeting we have, which will be coming up soon, the staff will share how they put the budget together so that we have a better understanding of their total budget process. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Polly.
Chairman Summers, let me just really quickly
Yes.
remind you, thank you, first of all, because you pretty much introduced it very well. So I appreciate that. Just a reminder that we can't deliberate this evening, and as a matter of fact, there's nothing to deliberate because we don't yet have a budget. Holly will talk to you about, from a pretty high level, about the drivers in terms of personnel costs that we expect to have a significant impact on the development of the next budget, which will start in earnest in December and January coming up. And you'll be getting a calendar that outlines that budget development. But again, Holly will just scratch the surface. She may pique your interest in a few areas. You may have some questions. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of work that goes into developing these projections and figuring out how we're going to comply with the various mandates that we have to comply with. When Holly's finished, Diane Brzezinski will talk to you about the current climate. Everybody knows about our CPI, or Consumer Price Index, and how high it is at this point. She's going to go over the primary expenditures that are non-personnel related, that many of which we have to do to comply with state and federal law, as well as with our own code. And then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So if, with your consent there, I'll turn it over to Holly.
Thank you.
Great. Good evening, Budget Committee. I'm Holly Roten, the HR Director here at the City of Albany. A brief presentation I will pull up here, make sure everyone can see it. Do you have that on all of your screens? Perfect. All right. So today's presentation, as the city manager mentioned, will be fairly high level. We're going to do a quick review of personnel costs and the impact they have on the budget process. Our objectives today, I'm going to provide you a fairly brief overview. What is it we're talking about when we throw around the term personnel costs? It is more than just wages and benefits. Those are also pretty broad categories, and so we'll drill down a bit into those. And of course, like every employer, we have payroll taxes, our FICA, Oregon Workers Benefit Fund, those costs that are paid directly to the state and the federal government. And there's an often overlooked aspect of personnel costs, which is budgeted overtime. So I'll talk briefly about that. Certainly in the case of public safety, we've got a 24/7 operation there, and we have minimum staffing requirements, and so budgeted overtime is a reality for them. And there's other costs that the city must bear associated with being an employer. We have workers' compensation. I'll wait. Where am I? Okay, so sorry about that. Found my spot here. So we've got workers' compensation, and now in 2023, we'll have paid family medical leave, which is a new state mandated program we're required by law to pay into. We'll go over how compensation plans are established and updated, as well as how personnel costs affect the budget as a whole. You may recognize this slide. It's part of the city's budget document. I thought it would be helpful to pull out this table just to give you a sense of where the FTE live within the city. Our largest single group is Public Works at about 130 employees. But if you consider public safety as a block, so police and fire together, that's about 180 positions, and it pretty much dwarfs Public Works. So that is the highest concentration of employees in the city. Something to note, the budgeted FTE table gives you a snapshot doesn't tell you the full picture. And what I mean by that is this is total FTE, so you take several part-time positions and add them together.
Is there a paper agenda by chance? I don't have a TV, I don't,
Oh.
well, maybe I do. No, the mayor doesn't have a TV.
That's okay.
I can get you an agenda after this, Counselor Olson. I can get you a copy. I'm just going through the slides at this point.
That'd be nice.
Yes. Just something that's an important distinction. You could have 1.5 FTE, and the automatic assumption sometimes is that that's a full-time position and a half-time position, but that could actually be 2 3/4-time positions, both of which would be fully eligible for full insurance benefits like a full-time employee. So this provides a good snapshot, but it doesn't paint the full picture necessarily. The city currently has 493 active employees, and last I checked, about 460 of those were regular status employees who are eligible for benefits. So a takeaway for you today, something I want to be sure and highlight, and I might mention it a couple times. Personnel costs comprise about 29% of the total citywide budget, but are 75% of the general fund. And the primary reason for such a significant gap, that 29 to 75, is that the citywide number includes enterprise funds, so water, sewer, stormwater, and there are large capital expenditures within those budgets that skew the number way down. General fund tends to get all of the attention, and so this isn't a presentation on general fund necessarily, but I did go ahead and produce the numbers with finance actually produced this for me. Thank you, Gina, to show you what the employee costs are within general fund. So this really paints the picture of when you take out those large capital expenditures, this is where the costs are. Employee costs and materials and services.
For handicapped people like me, it would be handy to label the various wedges here. I can't tell the difference between the little squares on the right. They all look the same to me.
Absolutely, I will be sure and correct that next time. The large green wedge is employee costs. It makes up about 75% of the general fund. The yellow wedge is materials and services. The blue wedge is sort of a catch-all,
can see.
reserves, debt. And capital is in there, although it's a very, very small wedge. So small it doesn't even show up.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. So looking at across the city, We provide a wide range of services to the public, as you know. Some of our departments are public-facing, like community development, public works, public safety, library, and parks and rec, while others are support functions that serve to augment those departments in providing services to the public. Those include centralized finance, HR, IT, and the city manager's office. In terms of compensation plans, it's really like running 10 different businesses under one corporate umbrella. There's no one-size-fits-all approach for compensation. We do have 4 bargaining units across the city: the fire, police, and 2 AFSCME bargaining units. There's a general unit, which is by far the largest bargaining group across the city, and a transit unit. Our highest concentration of positions falls under the AFSCME general unit, and that covers positions across the city, including some of our administrative staff in fire even, which is a surprise to some. And nearly as large a share is public safety. They are, if you put those 2 bargaining units together, they're about the same size as that AFSCME general unit. More than 80% of the city's employees are covered by a collective bargaining agreement. And I am very much just going to scratch the surface on this, but I wanted you to be aware when we negotiate collective bargaining agreements with our unions, we're doing so under PECBA, the Public Employees Collective Bargaining Act. It's the legislation that essentially governs how collective bargaining works in Oregon. And under PECBA, the city's required to bargain over wages, benefits, hours, paid leave, and anything else of direct or indirect monetary value. You'll hear this referred to later in the presentation as total compensation, which is probably a term many of you are familiar with.
Before you get to talking about this slide, how many of the employees that the city employs have to have some type of post-secondary education, whether bachelor's or beyond? I mean, I'm going to say that our finance director has quite a bit of education in finance through some university and maybe even an advanced degree. How many of the people within the city's employment have to have that kind of education to be able to be even qualify for the jobs?
Sure. I don't have the number off the top of my head. I'd be happy to dig into that for you. It's really, you're going to be thinking about planning staff, planners, engineers, management level employees typically have some sort of post-secondary degree. But a number of the city's positions, there's an equivalent combination of education and experience. So they may not have a degree, but they have a certain number of years of experience that would qualify them for that job. And there's different compensation plans that might account for education where it's not a minimum requirement of the job, but it's something that the city is seeking. So for example, within police, they have a base wage for an entry-level police officer that goes up 6 steps. And then if they come with or acquire their associates or bachelors, they receive an incentive pay tied to that. And similarly, when they get to a point where they have an intermediate or advanced certification, they receive an incentive pay for that. So it's a way of rewarding that. It's certainly an attribute we want to attract without outright requiring it.
And Public Works, I mean, if they've got trades education, you know, that in itself is, to me, a necessary post-secondary education level that they have to do the job.
And many of our Public Works employees have certifications within their field. So water treatment, wastewater treatment, and those are operated through the qualifications for those go through the state. And they receive a certification pay for those.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Okay, so I mentioned collective bargaining as part of the process. The city does look at the CPI, although, as you know, we're in unprecedented economic times. We're in a 40-year inflationary high. Local governments are not in a position to keep pace with the CPI. Some private sector employers and maybe some very small public sector employees were able to give CPI-based increases this year, but that's far and few between. It is something we keep an eye on, though. It does eventually catch up to us. It's something that begins to put pressure on the markets, and so it's something that heavily influences the city's wages over time. So when we talk about the market, what exactly are we talking about? There's really two things at play here. There's the market for a specific job. So for example, an engineer or a planner, where there's certain professions that cross over from public sector into private sector. But a lot of times people are surprised to learn that the city doesn't compare to private sector. We compare strictly to other public sector employers for that job. So the market that we're really talking about are our comparable jurisdictions. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as a statutory comp, and that's because under the statute, under PECBA, the city is required to look at population size and proximity. So that's what this table outlines for you. And you'll see some that are listed but then shown with a strike through. We keep tabs on what those cities are doing, but they're outside of the 50 up, 50 down. And so we don't compare to them directly, but we do. Bend, for example, was a comparable for us many years ago before their population just exploded. So we watch what they're doing, but we don't directly compare to them. And this is really to ensure that we're competitive in recruiting and retaining qualified staff. We keep tabs on the market and what our comps are doing in terms of wages and benefits. So how wages are established. The city has an established class and comp system. We're continually tweaking it and modifying it as needed to respond to the needs of the city. We look externally first, and then we look internally to consider how classifications compare to other jobs in the city. We have the Equal Pay Act to comply with. All employers in Oregon are subject to that. And that's essentially says that work of a comparable character will receive a comparable wage. And so that's looking at essential functions of the job and the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to do the job. And once the compensation level is determined, it's important to understand that we have to negotiate that with our unions. It's a mandatory subject of bargaining. So we provide them notice and they have the right to negotiate. And then on occasion through collective bargaining, every 3 to 4 years typically, the council ratifies a successor collective bargaining agreement, and that will typically include across the board cost of living adjustments. And occasionally it will include selective market adjustments for positions that are behind market. So how do we know it's behind market? We are regularly evaluating wage and benefit rates through a variety of means. We gather data through surveying our comparable jurisdictions, and we might utilize some or all of these types of methods depending on the circumstances. So for salary, we're looking at an individual classification or group of classifications and evaluating the position's salary against the market. Benefits, we will take a larger look at benefits as a whole, at that larger picture. And we might look at that by bargaining group to see what are police benefits like in Albany versus police benefits in other jurisdictions, just as an example. COLA surveys, we'll look strictly at what cities are giving for cost of living increases to see if we're keeping pace. Market surveys, those really just, it's a combination of the three above. It's focused on total compensation. And every 7 to 10 years, we do a class and comp study. It's a large study that looks at our classification and compensation as a whole and how the various classifications relate to one another and whether the compensation is at market. Industry standard for these is every 3 years, but that's pretty unrealistic considering the workload associated with it and the cost. So we strive to do them every 8 to 10 years at most. We did just complete one in 2019, which the council implemented as part of the 1921 budget. And we also utilize benchmarking. So that would be where we say, we essentially tie positions together. We say if this one moves, we believe it's comparable to this other position, so that one will move as well. So benefits is another pretty broad category. When we refer to benefits, what is it that we're actually talking about? PERS is probably the largest portion. Next to that would be health insurance. Currently, PERS is at 33% of wages. The composite rate that we use of 27% plus the 6% individual IAP contribution that the city makes on the employee's behalf. And I'll dig into PERS just a little bit because I know that's the hot topic everyone wants to talk about. Also included in benefits are deferred compensation, which is set by the bargaining agreement. It's different by bargaining unit. And of course, you have medical, dental, and vision insurance. And the city also pays some supplemental costs. So we have a long-term disability plan for employees, a basic life insurance plan, and an AD&D, which is accidental death and dismemberment for our public safety personnel. And another factor within benefits is paid time off. So wages versus total compensation. You heard me mention total compensation at the top of this. Really, wages would be accounting for base wage and maybe those incentives that I mentioned for education, certification. That might include a specialty assignment pay or a bilingual pay, where it's not an outright requirement of the job, but it's something the city is interested in compensating for that skill set. We also make contributions into a VEBA. It's a voluntary employee beneficiary association plan. Say that 5 times fast. It's a tax exempt trust that we contribute into pre-tax, and it allows the employee to use those funds within that plan year if they need to offset healthcare costs, or they can save it for retirement, and the growth is tax-free as well. It's a really great option for our employees, but that's something that's within our benefits that a lot of people don't realize. And you'll often hear HR staff, finance staff, and others use the term roll-up costs. That's if you pay this wage rate, here's what the true cost of that position is. For budgeting, we use about a 44% roll-up cost. So we're including not only payroll taxes in that, but the bulk of that is the 33% PERS rate, deferred comp, and other benefits that might vary based on the wage rate. So when we do actual budgeting, of course, we get very precise. Finance does a budgeting document for every position in the city that includes that individual's details. But a blanket average of 44% is what we use when we're doing cost estimates. So when it comes to public sector recruitment, it really is a balancing act between a competitive, attractive wage and considering total compensation. That's not always clear to our prospective employees, that you're receiving compensation in these other ways, even though the wage might be lower than what you might see in the private sector. So we really try to emphasize that. This is an example of, and it's small, I just wanted to show you the level of detail that goes into doing the personnel costing for the budget. There is a sheet like this for every single position in the city. This one example is one of our AFSCME represented positions at the library. It's a pretty typical cost worksheet in terms of what's included. Excuse me. These numbers are from the budget for the current biennium that we're in. So these are budgeted numbers, not actuals. So if you do the math between year 1 and year 2, it should come out to about 15% increase on insurance. We have to budget a anticipated higher rate for insurance just in case. So that's an example of how we do the budgeting. And you'll notice on the second column, year 2, the amount at the top 2 lines here, it's about $70,000. It's only about half of the overall cost of that position, if you add up all of these other benefit costs. So
This is a single employee and their benefits, that
it's one
one
position.
single position.
Yes.
Wow. I should work for the city. I think I'm going to quit my job and work for the city.
One thing I do want to flag on this, the PERS cost here, 27% of that is the composite rate that's paid to the state that's not a direct benefit to that employee. So it's not as though that contribution is directly tied and going into an account for that employee. It goes back into the PERS system. Similar to Social Security, we're all paying in for the people who've already retired. It's very similar to that. So this number here is not as though that money is going into an account for that employee. It's just how we account for it in budgeting. So I want to offer a disclaimer. I am not a PERS expert. We have no shame here. We will phone a friend if needed. PERS is the expert on this, and we know just enough to get ourselves in trouble sometimes. So with that, I will run through really quickly here. I think a lot of folks are surprised to learn that PERS is actually two programs. There's the PERS pension and the PERS IAP, which is the individual account program. The pension aspect is a defined benefit that's calculated based on a certain percentage times their years of service times their final average salary. And all of those calculations are available on the PERS website if you're curious to dig into them a little bit more. The benefit calculation does vary slightly depending on whether they're in public safety, general service, or there's even a PERS program specific to judges. And dispatchers is another one. I didn't include it here, but there's a specific calculation for dispatch. And then it varies even more if they're tier 1, tier 2, or OPSERP. And that's based on the date of hire. So as PERS has evolved through the years, they've changed the way they do things, and because they can only do it from a point in time going forward, they establish these new tiers, and it changes the defined benefit. So, for example, a general service OPSERP employee who retires after 30 years of service with a final average salary of $45,000 a year will receive 45% or $20,250 a year. That's their defined benefit from PERS. And that 27% that I mentioned, that's going into the system to fund the withdrawals that are happening today under this system. And then the individual account plan is that 6% pickup I mentioned, where the city actually sends that to the state, and the state invests it on behalf of the employee. And the investment account is determined based on their anticipated retirement date. The target fund date is what they call it. Again, I will refer you to PERS for more details on that, pers.oregon.gov. And the returns vary for this account depending on the market. And much like a deferred comp account, this account is owned by the employee. And Senate Bill 1049 went into effect July of 2020, and it redirected a portion of funds from an IAP to an employee pension stability account at PERS. And basically, they carved off a small piece of that 6% and put it into a stability account to help address some of the PERS funding issues at the state level. So the state changed its rules about investments, but the city's contribution continues to be 6% as it always has been. So the takeaway that I want to offer as it relates to PERS, the state has all of the control over what the rates are. They're set by state actuaries, and they tell us every year or every 2 years, here's what you get to pay. Thank you, send your check. So it's a larger system than just the city of Albany. And there's some additional costs that are tied to being an employer that aren't necessarily of direct benefit to that employee. They aren't lumped into their compensation. Workers' comp is a big piece of that. We have a workers' comp premium we pay that's based on a combination of experience and exposure, just like most insurance plans. What that means is that high claims will result in high costs and for many years to follow. So we focus heavily on safety measures to keep the claims and the costs of those claims down. And we focus on light duty assignments to get employees back to work in some capacity so that we can minimize the costs associated with paying salary replacement when they're gone. Premiums for paid family medical leave insurance. I mentioned that's a brand-new state program that the city is required to participate in as an Oregon employer. Premiums do start in January of this year if you're participating in the state plan, and workers can file for benefits beginning September of next year. And it does allow for 12 weeks of paid family, medical, and safe leave. And I've received the question of what is safe leave? That's related to maybe domestic violence, if someone needs to seek counseling for that service or go file a police report. There's a variety of things that fall within that category. At the end of the day, it will be up to the state. They will be the arbiter of what's approved. We won't have any control over that. And the city will do the intake of the paperwork and figure out how to manage it with OFLA and FEMLA.
And Holly, on this, are they just doing wage for the 1% payroll tax, or are they doing total compensation?
The state's calculation is 1% of wages. Yes, great question. And so the anticipated cost for that, I have it noted here, it's approximately $200,000 a year cost to the city to respond to the state's new program. That's all employees? Yes. Yeah. And so the calculation is 1% of payroll tax. 60% of the 1% is an employee cost. It's a contribution that comes out of their payroll, just like any other payroll tax. And 40% is paid by the employer. All employers have to comply with this program in the state. Small employers, which is fewer than 25 employees, they'll be allowed to avoid the premium. They won't have to pay their 40%. The concept is that large employers will essentially pick that up for them. So something I want to flag, and I'm spending a little bit more time on this because it is new. It is a new cost to the city, and it will pretty dramatically change the way that employers handle paid leave. It's something we will have to negotiate with our unions, the impact of this change, and all of that is still to be done. We haven't started that process yet. But it is considered by many to be the most generous benefit of anywhere in the country with the lowest barriers to qualifying. So it remains to be seen how that will impact our workforce and our ability to deliver service, but it is a big change for public employers.
So if, when a person starts with the city, are they automatically eligible, or is there a probationary period for this?
Under this program, they are eligible on day one of employment. So unlike OFLA, which has a 90-day waiting period, and FMLA is a 180-day waiting period, they're eligible on day one, provided they've earned at least $1,000 in earnings, W-2 earnings in the prior year from any employer. So it's not even necessarily $1,000 from the city of Albany. It's a benefit that goes with you as you change employers.
Wow.
Yes. As I mentioned, very generous and very low barriers to qualifying. And that was by design. The state was very open about that. That was the intent.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, seeing none, please continue.
Only two more slides. The city's financial policies center around conservative budgeting practices. So if, for example, in the collective bargaining agreement, there's a range listed for a cost of living adjustment, let's say it's 1% to 3% range based on CPI, we must budget for that increase of 3%. If it comes in lower, the CPI is lower, that's great. That helps with ending fund balances. But we never want to find ourselves in a situation where we've only budgeted 2% and the CPI comes in at 3%. So budgeting conservatively, we're always budgeting the top of a range. And similarly with health insurance, we typically have to budget between 12 and 15% increases. Sometimes we have, like this year, we had a great year. Our increase was 3.1%. And so that helps going into the next fiscal year. But we've had increases of 17%. So we just have to be mindful of that, and we have to budget conservatively. We did recently negotiate a paid loss retrospective plan with our insurance carrier, which is essentially the city gets to bank a portion of our savings to help and keep it on file with them to help offset future increases, to hopefully stabilize those so you don't see these large spikes. And so it'll take several years for that to work out.
When you say a CPI-based ranges for, for your COLAs and other things,
Yes.
what is your plan this year? I know you said that there's no way we're going to be able to make the 8 or 9%.
Yes, so the council recently ratified a successor bargaining agreement with Fire and AFSCME. Those have defined COLAs, so we aren't dealing with ranges, so that makes it easier in terms of budgeting. And I didn't prepare a slide with that, but I'd be happy to pass those numbers along to the budget committee through Gina. The police contract is still pending ratification, so I'll be able to make that available to you after it's ratified. But those fixed rate COLAs are good in the sense that we have a defined number we can budget around. It's also good for our recruitment and retention efforts in the sense that employees know what cost of living adjustment they're getting.
Thank you.
Holly, would it be fair to say that to soothe your anxiety possibly, that we weren't at the 9% range on
Oh,
those
no.
agreements that were reached?
Oh, no.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. And I'll be sure, and those are public record, obviously, so they'll be posted online for any one member of the public who'd like to have that information, and I'll be sure that I get it passed along to all of you.
Holly, can I add to that, just for clarification, because you mentioned fire and police that's dealt with, but what about everybody else in the current situation?
I'm sorry, I may have misspoke. Fire and AFSCME are ratified. The police contract is still pending ratification. I'll actually be coming to you with that on Wednesday.
That's right, I saw that.
When do you talk with, can't remember the name of the other, there's other unions that aren't police and fire?
AFSCME, yes. So those contracts are both ratified.
Okay.
There's two, the general unit, and then the transit unit, which is a smaller, separate group, but still under the umbrella of AFSCME,
Okay, thank you.
yes. And just looking ahead, I'll end on this.
Holly,
You have another
Yes, sir.
Council Novak had a question about others besides represented.
I meant non-bargaining, I just don't know the terminology.
At the council's direction, I'll be returning to you later with a recommendation on that. There isn't a collective bargaining agreement. They're covered under city policy, so it will be at the council's discretion, the compensation plans for non-bargaining.
Okay, so when the chair mentioned the current inflation, you're going to come to us with some sort of how you're dealing with that? Because his question was, how are you dealing with that? The fact that the cost of living is way, 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 way higher.
Yes.
And so is,
City, I can put it this way, yes, I will absolutely be coming to the council with updated surveys and data and information for you to consider. It will ultimately be up to the council what is provided to non-bargaining staff. I can tell you that the city cannot afford a CPI-based COLA or anything close to it. So it will not be that.
thank you.
Answer your question? Okay. Just wanted to offer this information. It's hot off the press. Gina got this pulled together for me today. The anticipated PERS increase is about, it's going from a blended rate. So PERS offers us individualized rates based on Tier 1, Tier 2, or OPSERP. The city chooses in budgeting to do a blended rate and apply that across the board instead of individualized rates. It's easier for budgeting and it smooths out the impact to some of our departments. We also did choose, and I'm hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn too much here because this is really Gina's territory, the finance director. But we did choose to collect a reserve for PERS, to set up a PERS reserve account to hopefully smooth out some of the increases in future years. That amount is coming down as far as I understand it, because we've got a little bit of a reserve built up. And so the end result will be a 1% raise, going from 27% to 28% PERS on each employee. And that's 28% of their wages. Yes. Okay.
Is that
With that,
28 instead of 33?
It will end up becoming 34. Within the 33 is the 27% composite rate and the 6% individual account program pickup that the employer pays directly for that employee. So it will end up going from 33 to 34.
Well, that's a little confusing and maybe kind of misleading. But thank you.
Yes, sir. With that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Chris Hansen. Holly, thank you very much for this overview. I'm sure it took a lot of time, and I really appreciate it. On one of your first slides where you're talking about head count, I thought you said the current head count is 493 or something like that, but I didn't see that on the slide.
Yes, sir. I will go back to that. As you can see. So that is what I probably didn't provide a very good explanation of it. When we look at budgeted FTE, it's important to keep in mind that this is inclusive of several part-time positions across the city. So one FTE, as we account for it in the budget, might mean a 0.6 position and a 0.4 together, so 2 people. And that's why I wanted to be sure and highlight that we don't have 416 and a partial person at the city. That's just the total budgeted FTE. Of the 493 active employees, a number of those are temporary employees. So 460 roughly are the regular status employees who are benefits eligible. 460 approximately. And that number changes with the day because people leave and people come on board, but last I checked.
So the total you said earlier, 493, but 460 are eligible for benefits.
Yes, sir.
So in general, since the 17 or 18, 19, headcount has decreased.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I guess the corollary to that would be, well, the head count's decreased, but the workload has not.
Yes, and another takeaway I would offer from this is, I don't mean to sound pessimistic in any way, but the only real way to impact personnel costs is to cut positions and directly cut service levels. And you'll have heard the city manager talk about that in his budget presentations, and department directors will often talk about that in their ability to deliver services or respond to the needs of the public, respond to calls, for example. Personnel costs are tied to people, and so without people, we aren't be able to deliver the same level of service.
Or protection. For
Sure,
instance, fire and police. I
sure.
would assume they'll take the same kind of cuts.
Well, there's not cuts proposed, if that's what you mean. I just meant to say that, as Mr. Hansen clued in on, the number of positions has decreased as the size of the city has increased. So you'll see that directly correlated with service level reductions. So, and that's getting out of my sphere. I'm HR. That's getting into the city manager's office and finance.
So you're talking percentages rather than actual numbers?
That's a way to look at it, certainly. The percentage of budgeted FTE per thousand.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Anything else? Great. Thank you
Other
for your time.
questions? Well, we'll let you off the hot seat now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holly.
And I will go back to Peter. Do you have, and Gina, do we have more that you want to
We do.
present?
And in answer to the last question that Councilor Olson had, in one of the charts that I provided, filled up with the last budget, was the number of employees per 1,000 people. 1,000
Your
population.
mic cut out.
I don't know. There we go. Strange. One of the charts that helps understand that is the number of city employees per 1,000 people of population. So that number has been steadily going down. So the next person we have is Diane Merzinski. And Diane will come forward and talk to you about those factors in budget development that are non-personnel related.
Good afternoon. I'm Diane Merzinski. I'm in the Finance Department. I'm your purchasing coordinator for the City of Albany. I'm going to go over the procurement guidelines, how procurement affects both the revenues and expenditures. Begin with just procurement authority and how procurement was established with the City of Albany. The state required our local governing bodies to adopt rules of procedure. So back in 2005, the city adopted the purchasing code, and our local contract review board is our city council. Our contracting agency is defined as our city manager. Our contracting authority for contracts, signing and executing, is your city manager and your department directors. Contracts that come to city council for approval are those contracts that in value exceed $150,000 over the life of that contract. And any change orders or contract amendments that would exceed 10% in the aggregate, those will come to you for approval. Council has allowed for temporary contract extensions on those contracts that need to be extended for a short period of time in order for the departments to go out for a new contract award. The City of Albany adopted the Oregon Model Rules, and we also utilized the federal rules, which you may have heard is the 2 CFR 200s. The adopted Department of Justice rules are what most people refer to as the OAR 137s. They cover those 4 divisions, 46 through 49, 46 being applicable to all types of contracts. The others are pertinent to either goods and services and your personnel services, your architectural and engineering type services, or construction-related services. Whenever there are federal funds involved in a purchase of any type of purchase, we must utilize those rules that are applicable under 2 CFR 200. Oregon's Public Contracting Code policy was established to instill the public confidence through ethical and fair dealings, honesty, and good faith efforts by our government officials. It's to promote the efficient use of our state and local government funds and resources. We are mandated to implement socioeconomic programs. We're to allow impartial and open competition so all people have an opportunity in all firms to protect the integrity of your procurement process in your government agency and the competitive nature of the process. We allow for meaningful competition that allows us to evaluate performance factors, all aspects of the service, your product quality, and pricing to make sure that we arrive at a best value. We preserve our competitive bidding process and take that very seriously. We want to make sure that all people have an opportunity to bid. unless there's some type of an exemption that is allowed for by state code. Was there a question? Okay,
I do have a question.
sure.
So under 150,000, it does not have to come to council
For award,
for, say that for an award.
for an award of contract.
Okay.
And 150,000 is over the life of that contract. So if you have a contract for 5 years, it's all the costs and expenditures for that.
That entire time frame.
Pardon me?
For that entire time frame.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
There's other contracts that do come to council, but they're for other particular needs. For example, an exemption from competitive bidding.
For example, what? I missed it.
An exemption from competitive bidding. I have a slide on that.
Thank you.
The city processes promote fair and efficient and cost-effective contracting. We do accommodate the socioeconomic programs that have been mandated by the state of Oregon, such as what we use for our janitorial contract using Oregon Forward is their new name. They used to be called the QRF system, which stands for Qualified Rehabilitation Facilities. There are sustainability programs that are also been required by the city to implement. I have a slide on that further down here. There's diversity, equity, and inclusion that the city processes promote. That is to give opportunities to disadvantaged business enterprises, DBEs, for a list of state-certified businesses, which includes minorities, women, and emerging small businesses. We have a link directly to the state site on our city's website that allows contractors to go right to their site and look for those potential businesses to provide them with opportunities as subcontractors or partnerships. The State Office of Business Inclusion and Diversity, called COVID, is the state agency that provides oversight for that program. Our city processes also promote ethics for public officials, and we promote the preference for goods and services that are manufactured or produced in Oregon. There's also preferences for goods from recycled materials that the state requires that we look at. The procurement goals of the city and our processes are to promote the alignment with the city's strategic plan and always to reflect the integrity and the transparency so that all citizens can have an opportunity to see what it is that we're making purchases for and the costs. Our goal is to have these contracts result in long-term efficiencies and effective solutions at the department level. It's important for us to acquire our products and services at the right quantity and a right quality, to the right place, at the right time, at the right price, to provide the needs that that department needs at that time. Our department goals are to perform our fiduciary responsibilities as good stewards of those public funds. The way we do this is we go through and check background checks on our contractors. We look at their construction contractors board, their CCB licensing, to make sure nobody has been declined, and we want to make sure that they have are in good standing. We can look at their bonds. We monitor performance of contracts to make sure that those milestones are being met before payment is made. We also look at the state's debarment list that the state of Oregon has on all contractors. And we want to make sure that whoever we go into a contract with has not been debarred either at a local level, a state level, or at a federal level. We can go out to a website at the federal level. It's called SAM, and System of Administrative Management, and you can look and find out a lot of information on a particular contractor or provider. And that is a requirement of anything with federal funding. Procurement goals and processes can provide economies of scale, such as when we go out and utilize a cooperative contract. Those particular contracts that the city combines, such as, for example, our delivery services that provide our mail delivery services throughout the city to the library, excuse me, not the library, but to public works operations, to the different fire stations, to City Hall. We provide all that particular service under one contract to get economies of scale, volume pricing, and discounts. We'd like to promote those opportunities for people to bid on our contracts at a local level, a state level, and national. We always advertise on our city's website, and we maintain 3 years worth of information out there as an archival, so you can see what we've done in the past, as well as so that other agencies can see and or utilize some of our solicitation documents. It also allows those vendors to know when the next time that solicitation will come up for them to bid on. We encourage and utilize the sustainable surplus property processes. We comply with Oregon budget law and the Uniform Code of Federal Regulations, which is mandated if you're using federal funds. We've been negotiating contracts at a not to exceed 5 years, which is a best practice from the National Institute of Government Procurement, as well as some of our other industry standards such as GFOA on certain practices. We perform our due diligence always to make sure that we have our best contracting results. The contracting process can also have some restrictions. We want to make sure that we don't place unreasonable expectations or requirements on our vendors to qualify to do business with the city. Those types of restrictions can be unnecessary experience or unnecessary or restrictive bonding requirements, excessive bonding. We want to make sure that our vendors do not participate in drafting that scope of work or the specifications for a service or a good, because that would make that vendor have an unfair competitive advantage. So it's important for us to do our due diligence to know what it is that we really need to be acquiring, and then to capture that and put it in that solicitation document. And during the review for those proposals, are we really getting what we want to obtain that will work for that particular department?
There's a question.
Yes.
Plan. So it says unreasonable requirements, but there are times when it is a specific task, a special type of building or roads or whatever that we can require that they've done it before. Is that right? The contractor?
You
You
can.
don't want a building contractor for a road type thing. And if
Right.
there's a specific type of overlay or whatever, we
You can add a statement of qualifications to a public improvement project so that you make sure that the person that's bidding is properly qualified to make that bid.
Yeah, that's what I thought. All right, thanks.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. We're restricted also to not impose an in-state or a local preference that will restrict competition. Restrictions by the state also include you can't fragment processes. So when you go out for any type of a contract, you want to make sure that you are you are looking for the entire project, not fragmenting it to get a smaller, to divide that purchase in order to use a non-competitive process. That's what we're looking for. Again, I had mentioned vendors can't participate in the process for writing specifications. They do not evaluate proposals, and they do not participate on that selection of a contract award. There could be biases, and there could also be an unfair competitive advantage in that respect as well at times. As mentioned before, the state has available resources for us to utilize. That qualified rehabilitation facility that I mentioned earlier, the Oregon Forward Program, That program is built there for business opportunities for disabled individuals. So we must utilize and take a look at those particular certified firms in our area, which is Lynn and Benton County, first before we go out to the open market for a solicitation process. Those vendors that appear on that list have been certified by the state. And this has been adopted by state legislation, and it's a must. We must look at this prior to. Cooperative purchasing, like I mentioned before, the state has their own site. It's called ORPN or ORCAP. Now it's been changed and called Oregon Buys. There's also cooperative purchases that will come to the counselors for you to approve if it's over $150,000. And we've also brought to you to approve some of those particular cooperative networks, such as Sourcewell, Omnia, HGAC, and we did that about 2 years ago. And those are the most frequently used cooperatives that you'll see many of the departments utilize. Mainly, we'll see a lot of that through the fire department with their Pierce contracts, or their engines. We'll also see that with many of Public Works operations equipment purchases. The state provides us with a state inmate labor program. They can come out and provide us with different services. They've provided and built desks for the city many a times in the past. There's transfer of property to other government agencies, and there's a federal and state surplus program that is available to us. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for sourcing methods, but this is how we acquire purchases, our equipment and goods and services, and our public improvement projects. These are based on dollar thresholds, which vary depending upon whether you're doing a construction service, a public improvement, or you're going out for goods and services and commodities. Small procurements, typically you'll just do a direct acquisition. Again, I'm not going to mention the dollar thresholds because they all vary. You've got informal procurements, which is, you'll normally hear it as a request for quotes, and your larger procurements are your requests for proposals and invitations to bids, such as for your street projects. Your exemptions, which I mentioned earlier. Matilda, I think you asked me that question, is that correct?
I don't remember, forgive
Okay,
me, sorry.
so this slide just says that emergency procurements, sole source, special procurements, those buzzwords you've heard before when we bring these to council, and alternate contracting delivery methods are all exemptions from competitive bidding, follow a completely different guidance. Impacts of surplus property disposal, you utilize sustainability methods. The ones that you see most frequently are we try to do interdepartmental transfers before we ever go out and sell anything that is considered surplus. And our surplus property that is over a certain dollar threshold does come to council to declare as surplus prior to us taking that to auction. We can trade that in on another piece of equipment. We can donate it to a nonprofit agency or another agency if we know they have that need in order to partner with them so that it's a win-win situation for all of us. We consider different methods of selection based on the market value of the goods or commodity, interdepartmental need, the environmental concerns, and historical preservation. Disposal methods can impact both our revenues and our expenditures, and I wanted to bring that up. The city has used an auction process over the past 3 years and sold about 107 items, which is equating to $166,000 that has come back into our perhaps equipment replacement. So it's very important for us to utilize some of these sustainable methods prior to sending it directly to the landfill. Not to mention we want to encourage partnering, help other agencies in needs. Did you have a question?
Just a question on where you've done, other than sales by auction, you've got donate to nonprofit or items of that type. Approximately how many dollars have we done that to over the last 3 years?
Oh, I don't have a calculation for that, but I'd love to look into it for
It'd
you.
just be nice to maybe able to pass on to the community that we've, done these types of things, I think. So.
I know that we have worked with other other cities nearby, maybe with Lebanon or some of those that fire has had an opportunity to do some or some transfers of equipment. But I'll look into that for you. Savings realized are also if we make sure that we can eliminate that cost of carrying that particular piece of equipment as obsolete product inventory. So it helps us to take a look at what are we storing that we don't need to store, that we shouldn't be carrying insurance on, and get it to some other partner that could utilize it. The challenges that contracting has experienced lately, those costs, those trends. Contract risk is based on exposure. Holly had mentioned exposure also, but this happens when there is exposure and high risk. We typically will require higher levels of insurance carriage on that contract. And the bonding is also something that we will add to make sure that that risk is reduced. All of those requirements increase the cost of that contract because they're going to pass that on in the contract price they bid. Long-term contracts, the city in the past always entered into longer-term contracts. They provided us with stability, allowed you to know what your budgeted expenditures were going to be. There's a reduced likelihood of these currently because of inflation. Those particular vendors are wanting to pass on those increased supplier costs. What we're seeing is there's a less interest in negotiating that longer-term contract. So we will negotiate perhaps a shorter term. Our best practice has been 5 years. Maybe we'll go ahead and just negotiate a 3-year plus 2 possible extensions. So we're not locked in and they're not locked in, and we try to get a win-win. Therefore, we're trying to be flexible. And again, it results in increased negotiation, which takes longer time to get that contract fully negotiated to bring it to you to council for award. Some additional challenges to contracting. There's such an increased sales and demand, and that was due to pandemic buying. You've seen climate changes occur that's affecting our prices. You've seen the trade complications and the restrictions that have occurred in the last year or two. Industry-wide staffing vacancies, unfilled positions, all of that makes the supply chain go even slower, creating even more issues. When I was recently down in LA, you could see all of the ships out in the harbor down there with pods, could not get them unloaded. There was probably 50, and I was just surprised because that means there's nobody to unload them and they have to take their turns. Those products are backed up. Hopefully they're not perishable. But those are the kind of things that that are impacting costs. We've also had products on back orders and delays due to that inability to obtain the subcomponents, such as computer chips that might need to be in our police vehicles, or a recent request for a new AED out here at City Hall in the main hall. We put that request in December of last year. It's still not here. It's on back order. Typically, you would get that maybe in 6 weeks, where we still do not have a date. So those are the kind of things that we're seeing. Frustrates the departments and the suppliers as well. Yes.
Do we have an opportunity to add other vendors? So if somebody's taking too long, we could go out to another vendor, or like send it out to 3 people, 3 groups or 3 organizations, and the fastest one comes back, we go with?
I would answer that as it depends. The contractors, the suppliers might come back to us and cancel that contract because they can't provide it to us. If you have a contract and you're under contract with that person and they will not produce, such as you could have a contract for services if you were in an emergency situation and they're supposed to come and do cleanup, tree removal, and they decide not to show or they just want to cancel, you can go out and acquire somebody else to do that and then go back to that other person that you're under contract for and ask them to pay for the difference because you're more than likely going to have to pay more.
Right. Okay.
So that is available to you through contracting methods. I've not seen us utilize that strategy here. We haven't had that situation, but it's available to us if we needed it. Did I answer your question?
All right, yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay. The other things we're seeing is there was a concern even at for public improvement contracts. Those contracts impose liquidated damages if that contractor cannot fulfill their deliverables and obtain that pipe or whatever product they need to, equipment that they need to obtain for their supplies in order for them to do that project. And so if they need to have it done by a certain ultimate completion date, if they're late, then they could be charged with liquidated damages. So we're seeing that we need to, when we set up our contracts, to really think about that ultimate completion date. Is it realistic? Do we want to have to amend a contract? We want to make sure that it is obtainable. Did you have a question?
No, I was the project manager for enterprise level projects, and part of that schedule that was contingency for cost overruns, schedule delays, and things like that. And if they missed certain benchmarks or milestones, there'd be a charge or a reduction in our fee for that particular thing. So I think you addressed that.
We can put incentives in to get projects done quicker, and we can also have a penalty in there if they are late,
Okay.
in addition to and/or liquidated damages.
Okay, thank you.
Speaking of lateness, how many more slides do you have?
Oh, I think I'm wrapping it up. This is,
Oh, great.
I think, my very last one.
All right.
You in a hurry?
Again, it's just the fixed contracts. Typically, our contracts are set with the economic price adjustment. We cap contracts at 3% or less, tied to the CPI, 3 months prior to the date of that contract being expired. And currently, with the contract, with the CPI being at 9%, that's something where when we get to that 3 years and want to extend for 2 more, they're saying, well, the CPI is at 9, and you're just giving us a cap at 3. So we have to do some creative negotiation.
So one of the things I did when I was working for a company here in Corrales, I would do two bid processes, basically looking at both sides, go one for schedule and one for cost. Because sometimes if you want it faster, you pay more, or you can take more time, you pay less, and it depended upon the supplier that I was meeting the demand for. Is there something where we can do something similar, where we'd say, okay, we want to go out and say, for this particular project, we want it fast. What's that going to cost us? Or we don't care how long it takes, what's it going to cost us? Because sometimes our priorities shift, and so we may need to have a look at both of those. Does that make sense?
Yes. We put in our schedule, but in the public, it sounds like you're talking about a public improvement contract. And typically, those project schedules are discussed after the award of contract. And it's awarded based on the bid at the time the bid was due.
Okay. Okay,
I
thank you.
haven't seen us put a sliding date in one of our contracts
Okay.
for public improvements. Did you have a question, Will?
No, thank you.
Just a thought, with what you mentioned earlier in Los Angeles, seeing all the ships in the harbor that couldn't be unloaded, I'm wondering, how feasible that is these days. Supply chain is seriously messed up. It's a great idea, but I'm thinking right now that probably won't work. Just a thought. I don't mean to be negative Nelly, but I don't think so.
Some of it's outside of our control completely. The QRF program, that pricing, when we're working with our janitors, it's set by the state. We're trying to negotiate some of that, but when they come to us and say we have a 20% increase and we're not allowed to that, the last time we went out and discussed it with our janitorial contract, we settled on a 5%. But the state typically sets their pricing. And also, just to let you know, one of the new trends for the state pricing, the state mandated programs.
Okay. Yeah, I can't see him on this thing. Okay.
They do require that they can come in and audit, and they are thinking about imposing penalties for noncompliance, assessing fines. That's something new.
Okay. Jared, what's your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to first thank Diane as somebody who is also, a professional supply chain person in a very difficult period of time for supply chain people. I applaud the work that you all do for contracting and making sure that the city's using its resources in a sustainable and controlled and transparent way. But my one question I wanted to make sure that I had clear kind of comes back to what Alex was talking about a little bit. Most of my experience is in private supply chain, like private corporation supply chains, and understanding, the value chain versus the direct cost. So is my understanding in our public contracting that the low bid amount is going to be the winner every single time or almost every time, barring like certain extra stipulations?
That is only applicable for an invitation to bid. It is
Okay.
based on low bid only, and they have to be a responsive bidder. If you go out for a request for proposals, which is typically what is used for services, then it's based on a majority of many factors. Cost typically is one of those, but if you're going to acquire a service, you don't want to award it based on cost. You want to look at their qualifications,
Yeah.
their past experience, what they can do to add value to that particular service.
Yeah, and that was kind of my thought. I just wanted to make sure that I had that clear in my head. And then I would assume that would be the same for your informal RFQ processes and your direct purchases as well.
A direct purchase depends on what you're purchasing, but typically if we just looked at commodities, if it's up to $10,000, you can do a direct purchase, but you still need to do your due diligence to make sure you're not awarding to someone that is not a legitimate seller.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Other questions?
I have a comment. Diane, I really appreciate this presentation. I haven't heard it done before. The full view of purchasing and procurement and contracting and bidding and all of that's very, very valuable information, and it's a good lesson for all of us. I think what I have heard is that the bottom line is that our goal is to not always go for cheap, but to get the best value for money, as my English friends would say. Our goal is open, transparent, and fair procurement of goods and services for the stewardship of public funds. I also wanted to add, I heard you say, and I wanted just to make sure that I have this clear, we cannot restrict purchasing or contracting to Albany businesses and Albany individuals.
That's true, that is state rules.
Yeah.
And I think I had an ORS citation next to that.
Yeah, thank you very much for everything.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I just have
Other question?
one quick. When you were saying there was state required, I was going to say, I'm thinking of the janitorial.
Oh, the QRFs?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
whatever, the ABC things.
Uh-huh.
Now, is the janitorial the only service like that that's required, or do we have others that fall into that category?
Landscaping or something like that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Alex.
Like landscaping,
Landscaping is one that is out there. We currently don't have a landscaping contract with a QRF.
Okay, so.
We've been doing our own, to my knowledge, or I think police might have a contract.
Okay, so so that's state required too?
I'd have to go out because the different goods and services that the QRFs provide, it can change monthly. They have to stay certified with the state. If that particular vendor fell out of certification and they were the only vendor in the the Lynn and Benton County area, then it wouldn't be applicable. But then maybe 3 months later, maybe somebody becomes certified. So you have to check that list. What might have been there last quarter might not be still applicable.
Yeah, okay. And then one other thing, I saw that I guess they're called, the people that are coming out of prison to help,
The state inmate labor program. Mhm.
Yeah, and I just wondered, I'm sure we pay for it, but is that a service that can be used for like some of like the landscaping, things like that? Or is it just on a per task basis that you do that?
I haven't looked at the list recently to see what all they provide, but I know that Rick Barnett utilized it for parks for when they needed to do some of the tree cleanup
Uh-huh.
after one of our last storms.
Oh, I see.
So
Yeah,
you would just reach out to whoever is in charge at that program at the state and/or find it online and acquire about a cost.
Yeah, 'cause I saw just the other day, or last week, in the Bermuda Triangle part of town, that there were a lot of orange vests there and stuff, and I thought, I wonder if that's the state labor or if it's just someone from here. You know, I didn't know, but I thought I'm going to ask. So.
I don't know the answer to that,
Okay, that's fine.
but I do know that we've utilized them before for cleanup.
Okay, great, thank you.
Counselor Johnson, if I can just jump in here for a second. I know in our court, a lot of times we will have work crew, and so people, you know, if they are unable to pay their fines, they can go in and work. And I know Parks contracts with the work crew to do some of the work for them. So I'm wondering if maybe
You know,
it
and
was that work crew.
right after you said the word work crew, yeah, that's what I was thinking of, and so I bet it was. And that's, I mean, it's great help to us, because that way we don't have to, well, we don't have the employees to do it, so, all right, thanks.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Well, thank you, good job, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Oh, no, he stepped out for a minute. What's next? Any more presentations?
No, there are no more presentations. I don't know if you want to wait for him to get back. All I was going to tell you is that, and I'll go ahead and tell you that, just thank you for your attention. As I mentioned in the email that I most recently sent you, the goal is to have you as knowledgeable about this budget process as you can be before we actually get the actual budget. So in January, probably the second work session in January will be the next meeting. But if you have any questions between now and then, I hope you won't hesitate to call either Gina or me and pose those questions. We'd be happy to answer them. Okay?
Okay.
So I'll jump in really quickly too. And thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. As Peter mentioned, we're trying to help the Budget Committee understand, you know, what some of the concerns we have. I really wish we could, you know, just go out and procure services however we wanted to do that, but we can't. Just like in our employee negotiations, there are certain things we have to do. There are certain things we have to do that frankly are probably going to increase the costs a little bit on that. So when we do get to the budget and we're seeing larger expenditures, you know, there's a reason why for that. So again, thank you all. And again, as Peter said, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know.
Any questions at this point for Gina or myself?
I did think of one thing. I was going to email you, but you just asked, so here's a golden opportunity. And Diane, if this is applicable to you, I appreciate you chiming in. I'm just wondering, have we ever considered using work crews to maintain our parks?
Yeah, we do. We consider work crews, and I'll let Gina chime in, and I don't know if Chris Bailey can actually talk a little bit about it too, but the work crew does not come at no charge. So we do have to pay for their services. They can't, there are some restrictions as to how they can be used. Chris, I would call on you if you don't mind addressing that a little bit. We have the fire department. The fire department has used the work crew to maintain Station 11 on an occasional basis, not on a regular basis.
I just think they don't come with all the benefits and salary attached. Maybe we should make optimal use of them if possible.
Yeah, various departments use the work crew for basic, usually it's landscape maintenance. We've also used them to clean up derelict properties, abandoned properties. They're a relatively inexpensive option as long as you don't need a lot of precision and care in what you're doing. They're fairly slash and burn. But yeah, they're a good option, and they aren't free. And the money goes to the Lynn County Sheriff's Office is the one we primarily use.
Thank you. Yeah, I get that they're not free. I just think they might be a whole lot less expensive than the people who come with salaries and benefits attached. That's all.
So Holly may be able to speak to this a little bit more too, but in our collective bargaining agreements, if we have somebody on for a certain amount of time, then we need to hire that person. If, I think that's correct, but Holly can explain that.
You're close. So within our, obviously within public safety, we can't have work crew doing that function. But within our AFSCME contract, there is language that says that if we've hired a temporary service worker to do the work more than half-time for 3 years, then we've established a need. And we don't have to hire that individual, but the city then needs to make progress toward hiring for that work. So within Oregon, well, it's not limited to Oregon, but unions have a right to represent workers who are performing union work. That's the simplest way I know how to explain that.
Holly,
Holly, I had a
as-
question on that.
Oh, go ahead.
What was that?
Chris Hansen, should I go?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Following up on that, the 3-year length of service basically for the temp worker, is that for an individual or for a service from a company? So if we're hiring the sheriff's department to do this, and let's say their inmates turn over every 3 to 6 months, it'll always be somebody different. So we could probably have it as a permanent service then, right?
Yeah, that's a separate issue. The 3-year timeline is for an individual. There's nothing in our collective bargaining agreements that prevent the city from using temporary service workers to do certain tasks. I think this is maybe outside of the question, Councilor Novak, but I think there's issues you run into, in terms of consistency with the work that's being done, reliability of scheduling, other factors to be considered. The work crew is a great option for one-time needs and projects. I don't think that would be administratively efficient or deliver the quality of service that we would want to provide to the public.
I was only referring chiefly to the parks, and then Director Bailey was pretty clear with slash and burn, so.
Well, to your point, Matilda, they use the sheriff's crews over in Taquina Park to kind of clean it up after they've had several, I'm going to say, family gatherings on weekends or big holidays, and we'll see those guys out there picking everything up. So they are utilizing that in the parks. Right.
I think that's great.
I was just going to say that what you're talking about, after 3 years, the union says, well, it's a needed position. When I was involved in the union over the county and stuff, it was like permanent part-time is what we used to call it. You could be part-time,
Yes.
but for 7 years was just a little bit much. So I can understand, both sides of that, where, if you have the same thing over and over and over and over for years, then yeah, maybe there is a need for a position.
Sure.
All right, thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Holly. Are there any questions from anybody? Folks listening? Peter?
Thank you, Chairman. No, once again, thank you for being here and for your attention, but that completes our presentation for the evening.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
then will adjourn the meeting.